I'm just going to be very direct. Where I am right now is working on a project that I thought I would talk about because it's consuming all of my mental space and energy. This is something I alluded to a couple of weeks ago about working relationships, something that I flirted with like many years ago on Substack. And I'm trying to build and develop that out right now. But given the cadence of how these live weekly updates go, most of the time I'm actually looking backwards at not what I'm doing presently, but what I did over the past week. And that is to share the process of the past week, some of the things that I'm learning, the stuff that's like bubbling up for me. And the biggest thing that I can point to from the past week is this like super dense, very, very, very packed page from Liberation is Local. Ooh. So this is the page that I made last week for our Sunday gathering and discussion. And as we were going through it on Sunday, it was like, wow, this is so much. It's so dense, so compact. And I think it can be pretty overwhelming. So I'm going to just try to like have a pretty manageable goal today, which is to only really focus on this. Are there other things that I should talk about? Other things that are going on? Yeah, like for instance, another thing I did was I created a zine for next year. This is something I've been doing for the past like 5 or 6 years. I create a zine for the coming year, and that zine is to conjure, capture the word and sentiment for the following year. So here's one. I've got an example. We're already off track. This is one from 2 years ago when the word was parrhesia. That's the Greek word for like speaking truth to power, if you will. Living truth, the healer and the proof. And these are so cute. So anyway, I've just created my newest zine for 2026. And the word for 2026 for me, doesn't have to be your word, is build. So one thing I'll be doing and have been doing is putting together the zine. I'm in the cutting and folding stage, but you want a little sneak peek? It's black and white. This isn't how it actually looks, but that's a black and white scrap of it about building. Anyway, I assume that that will be a lot of what we talk about actually in the coming weeks, but I'm glad I mentioned that. Yeah, so cool. Thanks. I'm glad I mentioned that because I actually made this page because I was also thinking about the word of the year for the zine. You know what? Let me just pause. Let me just tell you a little bit of my process. Last week, I ended by saying, like, there are some things I don't want to share. I'm not vulnerable enough right now where I have, like, protections up. But I want to return to that a little bit. Because one of the things that I have been kind of thinking through about this space is to do something more kind of like real-time live journaling. Um, I don't feel like it's really effective in my overall goals if all I'm doing is giving like summary updates of concepts, even though that's a shitload of what we're going to do today. What I thought I would be doing in this space is like really creating a little opening where I could talk very honestly and authentically about like what the thoughts and the feelings that I've had in the week. Which means like a personal kind of share. Now, we could say, is there wisdom around like what you share to random strangers on the internet? You don't have to share everything, thankfully. But there is this little edge that I've been wanting to push from like, I have still, out of all my 20 years of doing like publicly engaged philosophy sharing of my philosophy, there are still some very important stories and aspects of my experience that I don't share historically from the past couple of decades, and then that certainly still plays out now, like as things continue to emerge. So let me tell you a little bit about this word process that I go through. This isn't the most vulnerable thing, so it's a good place to start. I think it was in 2019, 2018, going into 2019, when I had my first like, oh, I should have a word going into the next year. Maybe that'll help guide me in my life and development. And I never like pick a word because it's like that's where I want to go. It's not so like consciously intentional. I sort of like intuit a word. And so that has always been the case for the past 6 years or so, that like in November, a word comes to me and it just happens. I don't even know whether it's like spontaneously, or this year, the way that it worked is that I woke up a couple Thursdays ago with like, oh, the word is build. And there were some precipitating events that happened before that like kind of shook me up a little bit and had me thinking in new ways. So I'm not surprised that I woke up the next day with the word build, but that's how it is. It's like not anything super um, consciously intentional, but there is this kind of opening of like, what is the word going to be? So I just kind of stay open to receive it. So build became the word for me. Other words that have happened, have really kind of characterized my life over the years, which I think is kind of cool. I don't know if I'm going to be able to like successfully ace a pop quiz right now about the words that have happened, but just for like the sake of trying, I think that 2019, my word was um, healing. 2020, it was creativity. 2021 was change. 2022, I think, was trust. 23 was becoming. 24 was Parisia. Oh, I did it. 25 was focus this past year. And 26 is build. So there's been a lot of like so much transformation in my own life coming from. I love that the first one was healing. I was like coming out of a very difficult space in a lot of ways, personally, professionally, in terms of a relationship I was in. So like healing was like, this has got to be a thing. And then 2020 became a creativity year. So actually, even if you go back and look at like my Instagram from 2020, I was doing photography, I was doing collage, I was writing poetry, I was like playing with all sorts of different kinds of medium. I was painting, I was doing lots. And I just like knew that that was the time to do it. 2021, when it was changed, I thought it was going to be that I was like going to like move to Santa Fe or like completely uproot my life. And what I ended up doing was quitting my job. So that was a pretty big change. And then I think since 2021, since that was a really pivotal like moment when things really did change for me, the process since then has been interesting. So if we were to map even 2022, which was trust, I think that was an invitation to trust myself. It was an invitation to trust others because I felt like really so much had changed. But and when you like facing uncertainty, like you just kind of like have to trust that things are going to happen. So trust comes up a lot in my work now, but obviously like trusting the process from just a few weeks ago. But that one was a big one. And I think probably learning to trust myself was also critical in the space of making such massive like life changes and big decisions. Um, 2023, I think was interesting. I maybe even wrote about that at times. I'm not sure if that was the year I did it, but I wrote some things on like my Buy Me a Coffee page about like becoming a butterfly because 2021, I mean, it's a pretty cliche metaphor of like the metamorphosis, going into the chrysalis, gooey stage, then emerging a butterfly. So 2023, when I was like in the space of becoming, what was interesting to me about it was that I didn't want to become a butterfly, and I knew that. So like it was like, cool, I've done a lot, I've changed a lot, and things have shifted, but this isn't the end goal. I know that like maybe I'm in a butterfly stage if we're tracking that metaphor, but I'm not trying to be a butterfly. So something else happens. I just know it's like a necessary part of the process of becoming. Parisia 2024, I know where that was coming from. Fall of 2023, October specifically, when that like changed me. Actually, also fall of 2023 was like a very, I guess, traumatizing space for me. I had a lot of grief. I had some sudden and like very sad deaths in my family. And so I went into like November and December of 2023 being like, fuck, this is different. Everything is changing now. And a lot of that was largely inspired by witnessing the Israeli genocide of Palestinians on live stream every single day, morning and night. And even in those first month or two, being just absolutely stunned at the implications of what was happening and how people were reacting to it. So for me, I made a commitment that I was like, wow, I am changed now, like on a fundamental level because of all of this. I am surprised that my word for 2024 wasn't to be responsive because that was something that I had committed to in terms of like how to move through work and life. It really shifted for me to say I always want to be responsive to the conditions of what's going on in order to stay connected to reality. And so this is an interesting thing as I'm piecing this together because to stay responsive means you have to stay sort of attuned to the larger scope of things. I'm saying that because for my year of 2025, it might sound like focus. Sometimes when we're focused on a goal, we're like narrowly focused, almost tunnel vision on a thing. But focus came for me after 2024, where the word was parisia. And that is like I said, the Greek word that really can sort of loosely be translated to speaking truth to power. But the idea is that it's like this candor and frankness where we speak um, the truth, or like a critical kind of truth, with the knowing of we can incur risks to ourselves, that it is likely dangerous, because especially if we're critiquing power, then that means that we willingly speak the truth, knowing that it could harm us in the end, like it could bring negative consequences. So Parisia was the word for 2024 for me, because I was just like, well, clearly we all need to be speaking truth to power. And there's this overwhelming sense of like, if you speak out too loudly, bad things will happen to you. And that definitely is true. So many people had really shouldered like unjust consequences for speaking out against like something so egregious as the atrocities of genocide. But I think that that still carries on. So anyway, when after 2024, I think it's kind of a maybe sounds like a dramatic shift to go into focus in 2025, but I can see the difference between like becoming, from change, trust, becoming, and then taking it all in and being willing to speak truth to power, and then focus for this past year. I went into 2025 knowing that with the reelection of Trump and then the administration that he was bringing in and what they were promising to do, that I would likely not make a lot of money, because everything was just changing in terms of the professional landscape of what I do. So knowing that I likely would not have much work or engagements for like consulting, I said focus, because I wanted to focus on what it is that I can do. And I think it's really neat, I guess, that the year of focus for me became actually such a clear year of big experimentation. It might seem a little bit scattershot, because I did so many things that are like kind of random and unique and different. I'm talking about like specifically For the Love of Strangers, and then which was the monthly thing that I did for a community, like a community experience. And then also the Gadfly, which came through after the summer of like trying stand-up philosophy in a different kind of way. And then of course Liberation is Local, and these are just a few. But I mean, other things that I tried, like I built a brand new website, I created a coloring book, and I did like a lot of different things that might seem not focused, but I feel like the focus through line through all of that was really like experimentation and trying to be as bold as possible, kind of like courageously focused on like doing what I know I can do, even when other people don't really understand or get it. And so the focus feels really big. A lot happened, like interestingly enough, by focusing energy on not being pulled from work engagements or contracts or expectations that like other people were asking me to do for them, which I like, but it's often not so deeply aligned with what I know I want to be doing or giving. There's like a negotiation there of like where we actually pull our focus. I think most people feel this way. It's like, oh, if I didn't have to work, I would be pursuing my art, or I have all these other responsibilities that pull my focus and my energy and my time that I even have available to do things. So really the window of opportunity to really focus on your projects is pretty small for most people. So I did the opposite as much as I could for 2025, and I had to like steel myself up to be able to muscle through the psychological challenges of focusing so much on just creating the things that I wanted to create, knowing that it wasn't going to be something anybody would necessarily ask me to do. So now here we are at the end of the year, and I woke up with the word build, which I think makes a lot of sense for me. I'm grateful for the year of experimentation and creation, and like doing so much in such a like singularly focused kind of convicted way. But I know that if I'm going to continue doing this, I have to build something more sustainable, which includes systems and processes and like ways, more containers for people to engage with me. So I stopped last week talking about this, because this is right where I push up against my own vulnerability. Because building like a business, yikes, feels so scary to me. I usually get immediately met with people who are like, aren't you already building a business? And sure, but the part that doesn't connect with me is anything around like capitalism. the part that does connect with me is that, like, you have to build things in order for people to be able to access them. So I'm not, like, categorically against building a business. Honestly, personally, I know this is just like a challenge for me because I have weaknesses and there are a lot of things I can't do, especially many things I don't do well. So I'm leaning into a lot of like my own nerves and fears and like deep resistance of having to build something if I feel like I have to lean into myself to build from a place where I don't feel strong. Um, so I already talked to my therapist about it and so this is what we're going to be doing. Speaking of, I've been also wanting to share for a very long time about like how I engaged in therapy in the past 2 years to help support this whole process. I think it's really like, I don't know, maybe it would be helpful and informative for people to understand like the very clear, like very pointed ask that I had when I approached a new therapist 2 years ago, saying, "Here's what I'm going to do." For now, I'm going to table that. Maybe let me write a note. I'll write a note for next week. When we talk about working relationships, I will challenge myself to share a little bit more about my therapy process over the past 2 years, because this is one of those stories that I've been wanting to like describe about and share around like how I sort of set up this process for therapy. And then now, in retrospect, 2 years later, I can see what we did. And whew, it was wild. um, a lot happened. Some unexpected like layers and turns, but it all was the process that, you trust when you're doing the work. So that'll be for next week. I'm just going to table that for now. When we get into working relationships, I do want to share a little bit more about the therapy story. So now back to build. Since I was thinking about the word build, when I was putting together the page for Liberation is Local, it became kind of like the theme of this page. And usually I'm not like so crystal clear on how this is all gonna lay out on a like paper page. So if you were to just, I'm gonna say, if you were to just look at this paper and this page as it showed up, I see a lot of words. I see a lot of words, but I also see a lot of like little chunky bits. And that was fitting the way that it sort of developed as I was creating it, because all those little chunky bits are basically like key concepts of my philosophy, the work that I've been doing. So that is why this page is so, so, so dense. And I am going to spend a good amount of time doing this. I feel committed to work through this because if, something happens, I die unexpectedly before getting out anything else of the work that I want to do, I want there to be at least this will be some summary of some of the key components that I have been working with for many, many, many years now. And I think it's interesting to see how they continually kind of like fit together. I'm going to do a plug because I don't do that very often. I just want to let you know that my coloring book actually is also something that like has many of these little pieces in it, like the chunky concepts. I put together this coloring book. I could tell you the story about this coloring book too, which is that I never set out to really create a coloring book. This was not my goal. But what I ended up doing is creating pages that have some of the concepts in them. So should you, or if you wanted to, go through the coloring book, you would actually be introduced to many of these like kind of core uh, building block concepts. You can get that, by the way, like on Amazon. Ugh. But the better quality book is actually on lulu.com/shop. I don't know the URL for it specifically, but if you go to lulu.com/shop, um, then just like search in cutie wisdom, I think you'll be able to find it. So, okay, now building blocks. Look, I'm on a ball today, a bouncy ball, because there's so much going on here. Let's talk about the concepts that you can either color in the coloring book or get a pretty intense download on this page. So I started by saying like, okay, build the future, make the pathways, create the conditions, and do the work. At the very beginning, on the top of this page, one of the key things that I'm talking about is just generally about the significance of building. And that comes through in the way that I talk about ways that we might be like trained or conditioned or taught to think about resistance to systems of oppression through a framework of resistance that's really about like confrontation and fighting. This is like smash the patriarchy, destroy the systems, dismantle the power structures. So there's like fighting, stopping, dismantling, destroying, tearing down. We get it, right? Like resistance as a form of dissolution of the existent power structures and how things are. I'm not saying we can't do that or we shouldn't do that. I do think we need to. But I noticed like many years ago that was like, "Ugh, isn't there something more than that?" And like people, I think, create this like kind of a limited scope of possibilities if all we think that we are doing is fighting oppression. Now, please do not hear me wrong. I'm not saying we don't fight oppression. We do. And there's something about this that sort of like dialectic of that if we are only resisting oppression through the form of fighting and tearing down what exists, then follow me here. We are like responding to the impetus that is set by the oppressor itself, themselves. So it's kind of like our solutions are predicated upon the problems that are put for us. So it's kind of like, if you're engaging with like a bully or a real asshole and they're just like slinging insults at you and all you do is like fight back by slinging insults to them and you're like, I'm going to get them. But then like there's something about like the power of that bully is actually engaging and hooking you in under their conditions of engagement. You get what I'm saying? So, like, resistance, I think, again, absolutely necessary. Totally, totally necessary. But I feel like too many people stop because we have been trained to think that our only options are to fight based on the conditions or the rules or even like the the problems that are set by the oppressor themselves. The alternative, or at least another angle to fill out this picture, I call a liberatory framework. That's not like unique. I'm not like trademarking that. Um, but I want to set it in a different light from a resistance framework because for me, liberation is not actually predicated upon oppression. It's without oppression. It's beyond, before, and without oppressive norms and structures. So even in the way that we like respond or engage, that's why I think that so much of a liberation framework actually is grounded first and foremost in a place of radical imagination, because the imagination, if we're thinking about it, is something that like we conjure up from a vision that is so different from being like, here's my opponent and how am I going to like take them down based on what they have, their weak spots or their weaknesses. So tactically, it's super different to come from a liberation framework when liberation is actually grounded in this imaginative space of possibilities that is inherently kind of creative, where we go, well, what else could be possible? You see what I mean? This is so important and so freeing. And so um, that's like the foundational difference of the way that I talk about resistance and liberation, if we're actually like using those kinds of words. And that results in very different processes and I think even outcomes, because in addition to taking down oppressive structures and oppressors in the form of like opponents to freedom, which again is necessary, we are also then faced with a different question of like, well, what does it look like to build? And what are we trying to build and create? So we can say, well, at least it's not that. Yes, at least it's not that. We know we don't want to replicate the bad of oppressive realities now. But if we don't have enough spaciousness and imagination and like wisdom or creativity or like truly even like the room, like just what I was talking about, like the focus of how we get like detractions on, sorry, let me say this. The ways that like things like your job can detract your energy from being able to like do what you love or what you're good at. It's the same thing that if we don't have the capacity, literally the space, time, resources, attention, the will, the community, the support, the networks to help like nourish the space where we can come up with something different, then I think we actually have a dearth of possibilities. This is like a failure of imagination, and then people don't know what we can do. So we end up saying like, I'm fighting, but we put a lot less attention on building. This is different. It's not even on this page, but one of the things that I've like now evolved into in my thinking around this is early on when I started to just like set these against each other. I don't even like that language. When I would present these two frameworks, it would be, oh, thanks for that link for the coloring book. I would say, here's resistance, that's not it, let's also add liberation, but now I'm even more pointed with it, where I think that our resistance, if we're going to engage in resistance work, it has to be grounded from a place of liberation in order to be effective. I'm pretty, like, staunchly committed to that. That may not make sense when I say it because it sort of begs the question of like, well, then what is liberation? Is it just this imagination? And no, that's what Liberation is Local has been about for a year and a half, is trying to really develop our understanding of what liberation looks and feels like, so that when it comes to time of, what else could we be building? How else could this look? What do we really want to create? Then we have like a lot more to pull from. And we're not just sitting there like hitting our heads against a very familiar, ugly stranger of oppression, being like, are you all that there is? I can't see anything but you. Um, so anyway, little nugget there that's not even on this page is that if we are to engage in resistance, I feel like we have to root our resistance in liberation first. Like, let our resistance be guided and grounded in liberation too. Just for fun, why not? Why not? Let's do that. Look at the very first page. Liberation is the ground, the goal, and the guide, even for our resistance. By the way, this coloring book, I did intentionally sort of like structure it so that we move through the pages of like the first things first, and then we move into the end. Which, do you want a spoiler? You want a spoiler? One of the very last pages is make it a true story, which I love, because then it goes from like just the imagination space of liberation to actually doing it and making it the true story of what really happens. Okay, there you go. Coloring book is a journey in its own right. Look how far we've come on this page. We are not even making any progress. We are here. Okay, so let's see. How do I want to do this? Okay, there are a couple other like many other major concepts that I want to take the time and dedicate to introducing here. Maybe you would even call these liberatory values. So if you're like kind of indexing or cataloging, like, what is liberation? I think there are a handful of like kind of basic values that are sort of, they make up what liberation is. Um, do I want to say this? Yeah, why not? Why not? This is my opportunity to do it. So the way that I've actually been thinking about liberation, this might sound a little bit like arrogant. Excuse me if it does. Um, I also need a tissue. So hold on. We're like living here as people with bodies in a real life, real world situation, bodies and congestion. Okay. That's cute. That's what lives are about. Let me start over. This might sound a little bit arrogant, but the way that I've made sense of like how to think about liberation is that like no one told me what liberation looks and feels like. So for the past many, many years, I've been developing my own kind of like way of describing it and understanding it, which seems so basic. Like, how do we not know what liberation is? People are talking about it more now, but like, I think liberation is the word for like the discourse on like social media and very mainstream spaces where like everybody's about liberation now. I feel like that really only came through in the past like couple of years. People talk about collective liberation, liberation for all. Yes, yes, yes. But do we know what we're talking about? It's kind of like equity, when the diversity, equity, inclusion bubble that I talk about, like, kind of blew up and everybody was all about equity. I would call that equity confetti because people just say equity everywhere, but not actually know what they were meaning or alluding to. Um, and I think that, so I'm not saying I'm the only one who knows this, and I'm not saying I'm like the origin of liberation in terms of a description or a lexicon, because people have been talking about liberation and doing liberation and being grounded in liberation for centuries. But it's interesting enough because, one of my biggest influences and everybody's hero is Bell Hooks, All About Love. And I think this is a helpful model for thinking about like why it's so useful for us to have language around the things that we really believe in. People talk about love all the time. That's been like forever. It was like, whoa, we need to love the world or love each other. And Bell Hooks was like, guess what? We talk about love and no one actually knows what the fuck we're talking about. So let me write a book about it with an actual definition to try to clarify the fact that like you say love, but you don't even know what love means or what that looks like in practice. And that's why I think we're failing at it so much. So All About Love is really just like the, hey, P.S., remember how you talk about love? Let me tell you all about it so that now you can really practice it in a meaningful, compelling way that's like convicted. And it becomes a practice. It becomes the action. It becomes the verb. And it's like been so hugely transformative for so many people. I liken the work around liberation and the need that we have for like understanding what liberation is in a very similar way. Like we talk about liberation, we speak about liberation, but what are we actually meaning? I don't know that we do. So that's what so much of specifically Liberation is Local has been about, is trying to like get more clear and intimate in like understanding what liberation looks like, what it feels like, what it requires, how we do it in practice, and then wrapping a lot of language around it. Okay, I'm so like distracted and digressed. Well, that's helpful because let's just move into here. This is the section on the page where when I'm talking about liberation, I'm just going to read what I wrote. Sometimes creating the conditions for radically new ways of being with others necessitates that we make enough space for something radically different to develop, which is a process, and then hold that space until something radically different emerges. Now, I actually call what I just described a practice of love dynamics. I think I talked about power last week or two. I don't even remember now. And I always emphasize that power is about the ability to influence the conditions of our choices. And if we use our power for the sake of liberation, then some of that like grounding, like the starting place, is about creating the conditions for radically new ways of being with others. That's an imagination piece. That's not being responsive to what we know about the current conditions of oppressive realities. And love dynamics is about actually making space and holding that space so that something radically new can emerge. It's kind of like a meditation practice, I think. You know, if you're like doing meditation where you can hardly actually, especially if you're just starting with meditation, clear your mind and have like empty space. That is not realistic for pretty much anybody. But what you do is get in the practice of being like, I'm trying to make space. And then as soon as I notice that like things are popping up and I go, oh, there you are. And then that like acknowledgement of like a thought or a distraction, that is you like trying to hold the space actually. So you make the space and then it's a practice of holding the space. And I think that most of us are not great at holding space because we so desperately want something to happen. And that is kind of a way that we're conditioned. I don't know, call it instinct, call it whatever you want. I just think it's true that most of us feel uncomfortable when we are making space and we don't know how to hold space because a lot of the time, people, when they're honest, are like, I'm uncomfortable holding space because I don't know what's happening. And I don't know what's going to emerge in this space. What if it's bad? What if it's great? What if it's scary? What if it's beautiful? What if I don't know how to handle whatever emerges? And so there's like this kind of constitutional strength that we have to build up to be able to actually make space, for one, in our lives, in our relationships, in our own imaginations, and then hold that space so that something actually has the opportunity to emerge in it that can be radically new, that isn't just like oh, I have heard of this before, let's try that. And like we're like grasping for things based on what's available to us. I think let's pause for a second, talk about radical as a concept. People often quote Angela Davis in this, of like radical simply means grasping something at the root. So if it's a radical change, that means like from below ground. We are not assuming we're just like picking the same fruit. We are starting from like taking the root and uprooting the whole system in order for something to be radically different. It is that degree of change, not superficial, but like at the core of things. So for something to be radically new and creating radically new ways of being with others, then I think we have to get in the space of love dynamics, making space and holding space so that something new can emerge. If you're following, there are like 5 liberatory values embedded in all of this. I'm not keeping exact track, but the last one that has emerged is emergence. I'm looking over here at this little pile of books that never has the book I'm looking for, but I was wanting to call in Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, if you're not familiar. Like emergent strategy is, I think, one of the best articulations of this, where we actually let something emerge. It's emergent, and that is kind of where something new bubbles up. So now you've been introduced to how I describe love dynamics as a shift from power dynamics, but still related to creating the conditions for our choices. Love dynamics as like the capacity to make space and hold space with the liberatory value present of emerging to see what radically new can emerge. That is again within us, between us, And just in terms of like coming up with new ways of being, all that roots back to a liberatory framework of how we build something differently rather than just fighting from a place of resistance. You follow? Okay. There's a little note here on love on the page. We're going through it, folks. This is gonna be, but we're going through it because on that, when it came to talking about love dynamics, right here, um, I put a little bit of more information than I needed to further clarify what I'm talking about when it comes to how to engage in love dynamics. I kind of touched on this just as I was spewing. But the thing that I wrote is that to actually engage in love dynamics, making enough space for something radically different to develop a process and holding that space until something radically new emerges. This demands a loving relationship with uncertainty. So the uncertainty piece, I think, is connected to emergence. Like maybe we don't know exactly what's going to happen and that makes people uncomfortable. Fair enough. Deal with it in therapy. I'm not serious. We can work on how to like handle uncertainty together. But I use this opportunity to say, wow, I'm talking about love dynamics. I'm talking about a loving relationship with uncertainty. So I'm really leaning on this notion of love that if we hadn't studied bell hooks might just sound like yet another one of those words that we assume too much of. So I use this as a space to actually offer even my definition of love, which is inspired by bell hooks. But I elaborate a little bit more in my own way to understand what love is. So here you go, the summary. I echo bell hooks in talking about love as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual development. That's what bell hooks offers as a definition. The will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual development. I think there in another video several weeks ago, I talked about spiritual practice. It's like, that makes sense if we are talking about spirituality as like aligning ourselves with our values and embodying them more. Yes. It doesn't have to be a religious overtone that makes people uncomfortable. Spirituality doesn't have to be like all woo woo or anything if that's like not your jam. But spiritual development might seem like it's doing a lot of work in that definition. I think it is. And so I have just clarified it in the way that I talk about love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own, fill it in as like a bracket, spiritual development, sure. Or I say one's own or another's healing, transformation, and liberation. These are three things that I think, I'm not saying it's exhaustive, but it captures for me a lot more about like spiritual development can feel and look like healing, transformation, and liberation. Now, granted, each of those words are also doing a lot of work. They're huge words. I'm not going to get into them right now. We don't have time. But maybe we'll make a note later on of like, what the fuck do we mean by healing? That's something people talk about all the time. Do we really know what we're saying? Transformation? Wow, could not be more vague and broad of a word. Sure, anything counts as transformation. Though interesting, a lot of people push back on that and they go, transformation can be scary and maybe bad. Or they think that it happens like in an instant, which is, first of all, I'm using transformation with a positive connotation. And transformation to me is like inherently a process over time. So whatever. But it also is very closely connected to learning, which I'm not putting in the definition of love. And then liberation, I already said, is like a very big word with a lot of content and context that most people do not understand. So my definition of love, echoing bell hooks, is really not great because it has so many subcomponents built into it. Even so far as the will to extend oneself is really talking about power. Will, as like our volition, our choice, our agency, we have the will, we do it. The will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's healing, transformation, and liberation, an expression of one's power. But remember, I introduced all this as like having a loving relationship with uncertainty. So what does that look like? I'm saying if we understand what love is that will to extend oneself, then it's also without the demand for control and with respect for the collective. That's what I think uncertainty means. See how I'm talking about like there's so much to unpack here? It's so dense. But I'm not just saying uncertainty for the sake of uncertainty as if like, who knows what's going to happen? I'm alluding to the fact that if we move with uncertainty, that means we are not in control of everything. And part of the reason why we are not in control of everything, us, singular individuals, is because we do not live in a singular individual world. We actually live as one part of many. And so we might feel uncertain because we can't actually control the whole of the collective of what everybody else is doing. We're an integral part of how community moves. We can have some will over what we do to participate in that. But overall, I mean, unfortunately, in many cases, we know that like there are a lot of people who are doing things that are not what we would hope to predict or make certain uncertain things, make some uncertain things very scary. So we, I think, associate uncertainty with precarity because we're not in control of everything and we are certainly not in control of everyone. But when we are practicing from a place of liberation, these like love dynamics, that includes, remember where we got here from, it includes being able to develop a loving relationship with uncertainty. And I think that is we participate in it without a sense of control over what needs to happen. And that sort of alludes to a little bit of maybe trust in the collective, or at least situating oneself within a much larger picture of like everybody. I'm not even going to go there, but like there's a lot that we've already said in these lives over the past few weeks about like being a part of something much bigger and what that can do for us in terms of our senses of responsibility. Yes. And like that it's not all on you to do everything because you can't. Literally, you can't. You can do a lot and you can do your best, but we all are part of this movement. So, speaking of that, one other really great nugget of concept that I slipped into even this part about a loving relationship to uncertainty is my definition of community. Community, another word. People say it all the time and maybe don't often know what we mean by it. So I'm not saying this is like comprehensive, but it has helped me over many years to describe community as community is with whom you move. On Sunday, it's interesting. Somebody asked a question of like, what do you mean by movement? Clearly, you're not talking about like stretching and dancing, which was fair. When I'm talking about communities with whom you move, I liked this question, and so I'm just going to elaborate right now. I'm talking about the movement of freedom and like will. So the will to extend oneself from the existential point of how I work in my paradigm. Freedom is an expression of the will that is expressed through movement of the will. Like we are pursuing something. There's a project to which we go towards and we are like striving for. So movement is really this kind of like movement of the will in an existential kind of way, referring to our freedom based on our choices and agency. And so community is with whom you move in that kind of way, like oriented towards similar goals, pursuing similar projects, and doing that together. Now, if you're following this chaotic map of a page, where we are is like right here-ish. And I do sort of summarize this in these two building blocks. So I'm going to read them because it captures this like respect for the collective, even when you have an expression of your own power. And that can sort of be wrapped up in this loving relationship with uncertainty because we are part of a community with whom we move. So I wrote, nothing happens in isolation. Responsibility looks like showing up. And then this was just something that came to me and I really liked it. Like take interconnectedness seriously and let that inspire your generosity. I don't know. I loved it. But I'm like very much conjuring up like Simone de Beauvoir here with the ethics of ambiguity, with her language of our freedoms are all interconnected. So what you do affects me, what I do affects you. And that is true across space and time. It doesn't even have to be like immediacy of like, cause and effect, one to one. We see that happen right now in real time. It can be what you do affects me, what I do affects you across space and time for generations. So the scope of like uncertainty when we respect the collective can be so expansive that even that makes people uncomfortable because it's like, well, now I don't know the results of our efforts and I need that to happen now because stuff is so bad. Yeah, I get it. But across space and time, if we are like situated to understand like a much broader view of what we do matters, then I think for me, I find that really comforting to know that like it's very big and it involves all of us, even when that means like people are capable of atrocity and terrible things. What we do still matters, and it might not pan out or play out the way that we would like to see in our own timeline, but that doesn't mean that it isn't significant. Okay, I'm going to keep going down that side of the page because I kind of like did this little rattling off of some of these core concepts that are not just mine, but I'm like alluding to Simone de Beauvoir and the ethics of ambiguity. the fact that what you do affects me and what I do affects you because our freedoms are interconnected. Um, I mean, if you really want to pull up like the activist kind of ways that this comes up, I think we see it in social justice movement spaces when people refer to the sentiment of like no one's free until all of us are free. That's like our freedoms are interconnected. Yeah. See, I'm just quoting Simone de Beauvoir from the existential point of view. But Beauvoir talks about that, the interconnectedness and the fact that we affect each other as part of our fundamental ambiguity. And the ambiguity is also that we can do that for good or for ill. So the fact that we affect each other means we can help each other, we can heal each other, we can transform each other, we can liberate each other, or we could oppress each other. We could violate and destroy one another too, which we are very much on track for doing. Just in terms of like a planetary scope of climate, for instance, not to mention war and genocide. So our fundamental ambiguity is that we are capable of all of the above. Maybe people don't like that either, but I think it's realistic. I mentioned the problem of inertia. This is just referring back to the collective and like our place within a much larger scope of people. And the problem of inertia is that maybe a lot of people are not moving in the ways that we want to move. Doesn't mean we're not part of community. It might just mean that like we feel outnumbered or overpowered by the inertia of the current conditions. Does not mean that what you do doesn't matter across space and time still. I have another note there about this is all about the responsibility of radical self-acceptance, which is kind of the Chani Nicholas astrology angle that I keep hinting at and like teasing. But I'm putting that in a grounded model of abundance within larger complex systems. I feel like abundance, just heads up, is another word. I don't know if you haven't said this on these lives. Abundance is another word that people are like gonna go off on. I predict that this will be one of the biggest words in the next couple of years, kind of like intersectionality, kind of like equity, kind of like liberation. I think abundance is going to be like the thing that people want, especially because we're in models of scarcity and people are struggling so much. But we have to understand what abundance actually means. And so we don't just have this like kind of positive, like whitewashing of what abundance actually is. I feel like it's a liberatory value, but it's one we cannot like take for granted and just assume. Anyway, I want to develop grounded models of abundance within complex systems. That's kind of where I'm at. All of that is why we assume the significance of fractals. That's a notion coming out of emergent strategy where what we do on a small scale, fractal, actually mirrors the larger system. So if all you're doing is engaging with your neighbors in a different kind of way, that might seem small and insignificant, but it is part of a larger system. And it's kind of like a mirroring effect of like what we do here does matter big scale. And what happens big scale translates all the way to our like smallest parts. And I wrote maximal responsibility. That is a word even from the coloring book, but maximal responsibility is a concept that I got from Maria Lugonis, and it's something that in 2021, when my word was change, I, for myself, coupled that with change from a place of maximal responsibility, not change for the sake of change, never transformation just for the sake of transformation, but always towards something. And to me, that conjures up like real significance around like our responsibility to do it well and for the collective. And then finally, on that little list of things, I said, this is why we always consider the children and future generations too, because timelines, it's not just all about us. We are not just acting for our own self-interest. And then I summarized really all of that, like everything is. This is why we use our freedom to open up more freedom for others, why we influence the conditions in ways that open up more good choices. So kind of like taking power and freedom all together and making that a space of like influence the conditions in ways that open up more good choices. We could even say that aligns with like notions of radical imagination. And yes, transcendence, if we're like coming from a strictly existential model, this is what we're talking about with transcendence rather than immanence. I don't often use that language, but it's obviously inherent in what I'm talking about. Okay, so deep breath. That was like a list of many different concepts that are always at work. They're not the only ones, but you can see there's like a big array of different concepts that help me think through the ways that I'm moving and how I'm making sense of the world and what I'm trying to do with my own work and projects. And on the I feel like on this side of the page then is where all the pieces like around building really came together. So I kind of took all of that and bracketed off and said like sometimes our work, what are we supposed to do? Sometimes our work becomes clearer once we recognize that it's just time to put the pieces together. I for myself, I know I was like really putting a lot on here because it's my process. But to me, putting the pieces together means like, okay, what are we going to do with it? And I feel like that's where a lot of people are. We're like eager to know, what am I supposed to do? How can I meaningfully contribute to changing the world or my community and improving things? Well, sometimes what we need to do becomes clear in maybe even that emergent kind of way, or maybe that intuitive way, or maybe the way that like a word will come to you if we actually just recognize that we have the pieces. This is even abundance. When we have what we need, now we just do something with it. We already have what we need, so let's do with it. Putting the pieces together is clearly a nod towards building. I wrote design, develop, assemble, connect, create, reinforce, strengthen the bonds, make pathways, provide structure, scale the systems, and fuel all of this in healthy and sustainable ways. All that is to say, our work is to build better worlds and brighter futures. I feel like that's like the project of liberation, build better worlds and brighter futures, where like things are free of oppression. Now, if we knew how to do it, maybe we would already be doing it. Fair? I'll give you that. So that is why when I started with Liberation is Local, and we did like this was always the seed idea of Liberation is Local, but it became very explicit in August when I kind of like said, we're going to do a different approach. And that approach first started with the page of learn how to be who we need. That is like the phrasing. And we kind of dissected that in multiple ways. Learn how to be who we need. Learning is critical. I already noted it. I think it's a really important aspect of how we approach transformation is just learning and maybe getting the pieces that we can put together is we have to learn the pieces to be able to have like enough tools, and like a robust enough kit to be able to make something different. So I am clearly, I hope it's obvious, like a very big proponent of learning and never for the sake of learning alone. I do think that learning changes us, but when we say learn how to be who we need, there are some pretty critical words there. Learn how. That's like a doing. And to be is really about becoming this person. Like you are the one who's doing it. So learn how to be who we need, not merely for the sake of learning, but to do. Like doing is the being and being is in the doing. So, um, towards the end here, we're now at like the bottom corner of this page. Thank goodness. A lot happened. I know that I like kind of put my brain way out on the table here, laid it all out, like, vulnerably here. This is what I wrote. Don't judge me. Building is a process. It takes time. It happens in stages. Duh. Requires discipline and diligence and using our resources well. Okay. And building is an inherently creative act. I would hope so, especially coming from a place of liberation. It's an expression of our will. And from a place of liberation, building can be the free movement of our freedom, back to like that transcendence thing. So building truly is like, I think, directing our will, extending ourselves towards particular goals for the purpose of nurturing our own or another's healing, transformation, liberation. That's just love. And I think it's like if we learn how to do that, then the doing is the being and the being is the doing, not just for the sake of like, oh, did you read all about love? Did you get the definition of love that I can now spout off? Can you spout off that definition? That's all this is about. All of it is about how to be who we need, learning those pieces and then putting them together. I ended this page by saying, can we meet here? And have we developed the capacity to move together differently in radically new ways? I hope so. But all that stuff about practice and discipline and trusting the process and showing up for the work and doing the behind the scenes things in a creative project, everything that we talked about of like knowing who you are and your role and what that means, like there are so many layers to all of this that that might sound cute. Can we meet here? Have we developed the capacities to move together differently in radically new ways? That sounds cute, but that is a very big question, like an honest, sincere, earnest question. Have we developed the capacities to literally move together in radically new ways? I don't know. I hope so, but that's what we have to try, and that's what I'm like thinking about the building. I said don't judge me because this is the last part I wrote. In radically new ways, is it genius? Is it faith, wisdom, madness? What is possible when we build and process together? I need water. That last part where I ask what is possible when we build and process together. Now, it might not seem like that's a big deal, but like I think that was the little prick of the most vulnerability I put on this page. Because where I'm hoping to go and what I didn't exactly elaborate last week is I'm trying to figure out how to build into 2026 processes and spaces where maybe we can actually do things in radically different ways together. And all of that hinges on us actually having the capacity to do it. So I'm kind of caught right now of like, how do you do it if we don't have the capacity to do it? We have to develop the capacities to be able to move together differently. And then also, but the learning is a part of the being and the doing. And so right now it's like a big nest of mush in my head. And it feels vulnerable because I know that when I'm like, great, 2026, the year of build, what I'm actually challenging myself to is like to build something that allows us to be together in radically different ways that actually helps facilitate this process of transformation and being together and moving. And that feels scary because it's uncertain. I don't know how that's going to go exactly. And I also don't know if everybody's going to like be able to get it or join. I don't need everybody. I don't even need a lot of people. But I know that it is my challenge to do it. And hence why all I did was just recently wake up with the word build. Thank goodness 2026 is the year ahead, and there's more room to explore what that actually looks like. The last teaser that I'm going to give you is from this page because here I did this little cutie, and if you can see it, the cutie's saying like, "Oh my god, are we finally going to address performativity?" Um, and I can't wait for this because I have truly, honestly been threatening for years since 2020, like since 2020 explicitly. I want to let you know. I think we, as a mass collective of social justice warriors, have really ruined the word performativity. And it's out of hand. It turned into performative activism. Now there's like performative men competitions, like satirically. And we have ruined the mainstream understanding of what it means to be performative. And I just have to let you know, it has killed me inside. Because since 2020, when performative became the most pejorative thing you could call an ally, um, as like vacuous, just for optics, not really any substance. It's not meaningful. You just want to look a certain kind of way. Ugh, my heart broke because performativity, my friends, is I think one of the only things that we've got as a concept to save us. And I'm not going to say it now. I love teasing people on this. Just wait for later when I hope to be able to get into like why performativity I think is one of the most critical, crucial, necessary, highly, highly valuable concepts for us to understand if we are really going to be able to move from a framework of liberation where we are creating and building new things. Honestly, that's it. So this is the most I'm going to give you though. Right here on the page, the little cutie says, "Oh my God, are we finally going to address performativity?" And I describe it as where non-ideal conditions of our current material realities meet the last remaining slice of hope for any sense of agency. So performativity is like the blood that makes our will, our freedom, our responsibility, the ways that we extend ourselves, the how we move together, it's what makes all of that meaningful in terms of actually being able to change the world. So don't give up on performativity. I know I'm not giving you a whole lot more. You might be like, well, then just say it. Fucking say it. I don't want to yet. I'm tired. It's already been an hour. Anyway, okay. I'm going to share one last thing, which is it's in the coloring book here as something that I named. I often refer to this as a bit of wisdom that has inspired a lot of my work. And that phrase is create what you know you need. I still stand by that. I think it's helpful. I use it again for myself a lot of the time. And it was just an interesting thing just to be transparent about my own processes of learning and how our ideas like evolve and change and shift and grow. That when I was making this page, I was like, oh, well, another way of thinking about that is also create what you know we need. So when it comes to building, I think that if we have the necessary parts and pieces and we have learned enough to help us expand our capacities to do things differently and we move together in ways that are functioning differently from just the reactivity of resistance to oppression, but really coming from a place of liberation, We have space for love dynamics. We hold that space. We see what emerges. There's all these pieces you see coming together. And from that place, I think maybe the next step of what it means to build is to create what you know we need together, collectively. Um, so that's where I think I'm going to end this one. It was a lot. And again, this page has so much in it. It was overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people who came to Liberation as Local and were like, help me understand. I need definitions. I need a glossary. I was like, yeah, I know, because it's like dense. All these words have a lot of meaning packed into them. That's why I wanted to go through it today. So now you have the video, now you have this conversation. And you can also have this page if you want. You can find it on Substack in the chat. I'm putting all of the weekly pages that I create for Liberation as Local in there. And again, I'm trying to be honest about where I'm going into 2026. And I feel like the building part, like what I offered you is that little bit of like, "Ooh, I'm scared, I'm nervous about what it looks like to build. And I really seriously want to continue this like thread that I've been on for 2025 of creating in a very experimental kind of way. I want to build in a very experimental kind of way too. So I'm just inviting you to join me if you would like. I don't know exactly yet how that's going to look, but I'm forming it now, and I'm sure it'll change and grow. It'll be emergent and it'll evolve, and that's fine. Um, so Substack, follow me there, get your pages. If you want coloring book to get access to more of the stuff. And then in the next few weeks, what I'm planning on doing through the rest of the month, when we look back at the Sunday pages, Liberation as Local is going to be focusing on the working relationships, what I talked about. So like it's going to feel a little bit different, but I'm going to shift at least for a short period of weeks to be talking about working relationships and what I mean by all of that. It's so dense that it's like overwhelming for me. So there will be plenty to unpack. Anyway, thank you for joining. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. If you want to find more ways to support me, you can go to my website, coriwong.com. And there's a page called Love and Artists, which just happens to also be the name of the finale for the Love of Strangers that's happening soon. Love and Artists. So I'm sure we'll have to talk about that too at some point. Anyway, thank you for joining, and I'll see you soon.